This is the final lecture, thank goodness. Anglo-America. Anglo-America is the United States and Canada. It's called Anglo-America because Anglo comes from the same root word as English. And so typically most of Canada and the United States speaks English, so therefore the region is known as Anglo-America. We're going to look at Canada and the United States. Looking at the physical regions, we have three major regions. You have the mountainous region of the west, which is a continuation of the Sierra Madres through Mexico. That's the Rockies, which carry all the way up in through Canada and kind of split off once you get into the Yukon Territory and Alaska. You have the Great Plains, which includes the coastal plains, central lowlands, the Canadian Shield, and you also have the Appalachian Mountains, or Appalachian Mountains. It depends on where you're from. The Coast Range is a very small mountain range, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 feet above sea level. That's right along the coastline of Washington State, Oregon, and California. If you go north of San Francisco, you'll find this mountain range, and you can see how it goes several hundred feet straight out of the water with that range. The Rockies is the big, important mountain range of North America, or Anglo-America, with some of the mountains reaching up into 14, 15, 16,000 feet. Very beautiful, very scenic, a lot of tourism. A lot of people go to the Rockies to go ski or to see bears or whatever. Then you have the Great Plains. The Great Plains are relatively flat, but not always flat. There are some hills in Kansas and Nebraska, but we always think of like Iowa as being flat, but it's not always flat. There are some hills, and you'll find some buffalo and a lot of wheat being grown there. Then you have the Appalachians, or Appalachians. Highest peak is a little over 6,000 feet in North Carolina. Most of these mountains are between 2,000 to 4,000 feet above sea level. Hilly, served as a barrier way back in the day between the coast when there was settlement and the plains. Then you have the Eastern Plain, or the Coastal Plain as it's known as. And this is Boston here along the Eastern Plain. Some places the plain is very broad and very wide open. Some places it's very narrow. But the main thing is today this Eastern Plain is full of a lot of major cities throughout Canada and the United States. What happened? One of the major features I would like to note here is the St. Lawrence Seaway. The St. Lawrence Seaway actually starts with Lake Superior at Minnesota, and you can take a ship, and haul cargo through the locks. And this is what a lock is. Basically, it's a couple of pools of water that they add or deduct water from to raise and lower as it goes from one body of water to another. So if you want to go from Lake Superior to Lake Huron, you'll have to drop a couple of 100 feet. But there's not a waterfall. You just take the boat over. You go through these canals or these locks here, and the locks will open and close, adding more water, taking water away to raise or lower the boat. And these locks go all the way through Lake Michigan, Huron, Erie, and then bypass Niagara Falls into Ontario, and then down the St. Lawrence River through the main heart of Canada all the way out into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the Atlantic Ocean. There's also the Mississippi River system, which is the largest system in North America. You have some of the major rivers like the Arkansas, the Missouri, the Upper Mississippi, the Ohio, which are all part of this system, the Missouri being the longest tributary of it, which actually starts right here at Yellowstone and carries all the way through back out. Looking at the history of the Americas, we'll start out with the natives. And the native tribes have different groups, different variations. You have groups like the Lakota, or the Sioux, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Apache, the Utes, the Athapaskans, and there are many groups that are still around today. Many of them live on reservations. Several of them live in Oklahoma because that's where a lot of them were forced off to. But there are natives that live in other places like Arizona, Mississippi, northern Canada. They're a group known as the Inuits we'll get to later. The first European contact that we know of is when the Vikings actually sailed across Europe the top of Europe to Iceland, Greenland, and then into Canada. And they lived there for several hundred years until weather turned and it forced the Vikings to retreat and move back to Europe. After that, we have the Spanish, led first by Christopher Columbus and later by other explorers like Coronado, De Soto, others, and then eventually the English, French, and Russians actually got into the exploration game as major players in North America. The Russians ended up settling parts of the Pacific coast from Alaska, parts of the Canadian Pacific, all the way down to near San Francisco. In the 1760s, you have the French and Indian War. And the French and Indian War was not actually a war between the French and the Indians. It was a war between the French and the British for control of different colonies in Canada and the United States. And this did two very special things. For the United States, it set up how to fight a war for independence, or how to strategize for a war for independence. On the Canadian side, though, it placed, because before this time, Canada was split into two major realms, the French realm and the English realm. And with the French loss of the French and Indian War, also called the 7 Years' War, the French gave up their claims in Canada to the English. But the English decided that they would allow the French-speaking people in Canada to continue to live and speak French. So it permitted a French and an English division in Canada, which is still present today. With the American independence movement, we have, well, this is the Boston Massacre down here is a picture. But with this independence, the United States eventually broke away from the British, and Canada started to fill with a lot of British loyalists who were from the United States. Other loyalists that did not end up in Canada ended up moving beyond the Appalachians to places like Mississippi and Tennessee and Kentucky to get away from the war itself. After the United States gained its independence in 1770, well, they declared their independence in 1776, but it wasn't until the 1780s when the U.S. actually got to unite as a full country. And the East Coast was the first area to be filled in, and then settlers moved across the Appalachians into Illinois, Indiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, and then they started crossing the Mississippi into places like Louisiana, Texas, and Missouri, and then they jumped across to California, and then they started filling the in-between space between California and the Mississippi River, and so that was the last area to settle. With the immigration, Canada's the exact same way. They settled the East Coast first, Ontario, Quebec, into Manitoba. Then they filled in British Columbia along the Pacific coast, and then they started filling in the area in between. Then they settled the north. Western Europeans were the first immigrants to come. The French, the British, the Spanish. Later they were followed by the Irish and the Germans. And then by the 1880s, you start seeing a lot of Italians coming to the United States. People from Greece, Slovakia, Yugoslavia, Russians. And then after the 1920s and 1930s, you see a lot more Asians and Latinos coming to the United States. So you see people coming from Japan, from China, from Vietnam and Cambodia after the wars there, and a lot of Latinos that moved from Mexico, Colombia, Guatemala, that moved for a better life here in the United States. Looking at Canada, Canada is a huge country. It's the second largest country in the world by area. As you can see, it's split up into provinces instead of states. The capital city is Ottawa, but the largest city and the most important city is Toronto. We'll get to those in a minute. Most people who live in Canada live in the southern part of Canada because that's the warmest part of Canada. Most Canadians speak English. Some do speak French. There are a few other languages. And Canada is very closely connected to the United States. This chart here shows how many exports come from Canada and the U.S. And a lot of this is oil, because Canada has a lot of oil. And people don't realize that Canada produces a lot of oil and gas, and we do get a lot of oil and gas from Canada. So when you hear on a commercial they say North American gas, a lot of that is coming from Canada. Yes, the United States produces a lot too.